right. So now that you have that in your wheelhouse, let's zoom in on this piece here. That portion where G is less than B and A. That right-hand quadrant over here that you hopefully sent me a homework answer to. What percentage of human activity do you think fits into this category where G is less than B and A? So let's zoom in on this. So hopefully one of the first things you take away from this is there's actually a lot less scope for G. Not because we don't like collective action, but because there's a lot of trade-offs here. And so there's a relatively small, I suspect, don't know the exact number, but I suspect the portion where G is less than B and A, particularly once we factor in lobbying and rational ignorance, rational, irrationally, all the issues with voting, that there's many cases where G is actually considerably higher than B and A. So, but let's zoom in on that subset, because that's what most people want to understand. They say, oh, but look, we want to figure out, we know all this stuff about markets. You economists are all full of yourselves about the importance of markets and voluntary exchange, but look, there's some things where we just are going to have to use collective action. Now, again, my rejoinder would be that oftentimes collective action may be more costly than just living with the spillover, but let's now zoom in on that anyways. And let's say here, we have a cost, a measure of cost. And we have a share of the population that is necessary for us to make a decision collectively. So in other words, this is what we would call a decision rule. The decision rule would be which percentage of the population is necessary to get a policy in place. We could have 10%, we could have 90%, we could have 50%. There's a whole range in there. So let's think here about the costs. Now, there's going to be some costs that I'm going to worry about. One is going to be, and I'll put this one in black, decision-making costs. In other words, the time, energy, and resources we are going to have to spend getting together to come up with, just arguing, negotiating, etc. So if we have a very, very small portion of the population necessary for us to have a decision, I think we can understand the costs, the decision-making costs are going to be very low. Basically, if it's one person, 1% of the population, it's me and a couple of friends, we get together and we say, you know what, I think this is a really good idea. On the other hand, when we're out close to 100%, we're going to spend a huge, a monumental amount of time and energy here on decision-making costs. And so basically, as we approach 100%, maybe that's what our decision-making cost function looks like. Put this in dotted. Oh, here's 100%. There we go. Okay. So the higher our level of majority that we require to make a decision, the higher the costs. However, I think we all also have an understanding that if we had a bunch of decisions that were being taken, like currently about whether people should go out or not, where only 1% of the population got to make a decision for everybody, the decision-making costs would be low, but a lot of us would have policies imposed on us that really destroy a lot of value for us. This is what we're going to call external costs. The costs imposed on people against their will as a result of a one-size-fits-all government policy through collective action. Now, what's that going to look like? Well, as we get towards 100%, that cost is going to be very low because I have to say yes before this policy gets enacted. And so at 100%, it turns out the external cost would have to be zero. Nobody could open a policy or enact a policy without my agreeing to it, which means the external cost would be zero. However, with that small percentage of the population necessary, yeah, it turns out that there's going to be a really high external cost. So if we were going to say, make a decision for the class about what food we were all going to eat that day. We all had to eat the same food. We're going to do this collectively. Now, again, I think it's really hard to imagine that G would be less than B and A. But let's say we decided to make a decision collectively in that instance. Well, if we had any one person got to decide for the group, there's a really high likelihood that most of us are going to end up eating food that we're really not that fond of. On the other hand, in order for us to order out, we have to have 100% of the population agreeing, then nobody's going to eat food that they don't like. Using just G, remember, because we, of course, might, through trying moral suasion and voluntary association and maybe some bribery, we might try and get people to agree. But that would be B. That would be voluntary exchange and association, and we're just looking here at G. And we're assuming here that people are voting. So, after the last discussion, you should be somewhat suspicious here. The key is, as we have a larger share of the population required for a decision, then we start to get its external cost function that looks like this. Now, there's no reason these need to be symmetrical. This is, again, a framework for starting to have discussions. On some issues, this line actually might look more like this. And we could try and figure out on what issues those things are. But right now, this is for figuring out whether or not what we would want to do, arguably, is, it turns out, decision rules, we have a range of decision rules in here that will produce different levels of cost. So I'll try and find a color that works here. If we use this decision rule right here, this is going to be our decision-making cost. And this is going to be, this whole distance will be our external cost. And so the total cost is going to be there. On the other hand here, this would be our decision-making cost. This would be our external cost. So we add those two together, and that would be our total cost, what we would, in fancy jargon, call interdependence costs, right? These would be the cost of making a decision using G at this decision rule. How about here? Well, by the way, there's no reason where they cross is necessarily going to be the minimum. And actually, it probably is going to be the minimum, but there's no guarantee that's going to be 50%. That's definitely the case. And then here, and then here. So what do we end up with is the cost of using G, if we think about it. Maybe it looks like, try and clean that up, right? And so what that would say is that we would want to, in a perfect world, what we would want to do is use the decision rule that has the lowest cost here. Now there's no, as I mentioned, there is absolutely no reason to think analytically that the optimal decision rule is 50%. You should think about what's the cost here. Now there might be some things, if you think about should we use collective action to decide who any one of us can have sex with, right? In other words, we're going to do that. What do you think that cost function, I think decision-making costs are going to probably look like this, right? If we require a larger group to make a decision for one person, the decision-making costs are going to go up. But I think most of us can start to understand that the external costs, until we get very close to majority, the external costs of people deciding who gets to have sex with whom and who has to have sex with whom, basically, until we get very close to unanimity, those costs may be very, very high. I may have to sleep with somebody I'm not attracted to. I may have to sleep with a gender that I'm not interested in. And so I think that's a case where our decision-making costs probably look like this. And so our actual interdependence costs would look like that. Thus meaning that our lowest point is going to be over here. Well, why is that relevant? Well, I know I have a bunch of lines here, but first of all, this is a framework for having discussions, because it does matter a lot. So this is, last year we had a discussion over in the College of Business. We had some issues with, people, it was simple majority, 50% of the faculty in a department plus one necessary to select the chair of the department. And people had hurt feelings, and they had gotten upset with one of the chairs and tried to remove the chair because they weren't doing what that chair wanted what they wanted the chair to do, whole bunch of stuff. And so we were voting again for a new chair. And I said, why are we doing 50%? Given that most people seem to be kind of upset with the last chair, it would seem to me like the optimal decision rule here is going to be well above 50%, a supermajority, maybe 3/4, maybe 80%. Because then at least the chair, right? Why 50%? Basically, chairs can impose a fairly high cost on faculty by enacting policies that maybe are harmful to faculty. They can decide who gets to teach summer classes and who gets which schedules and who gets some grant money and various things like that. And I said, I don't think the true optimum is maybe 50% here. Now, I don't think it's 98%. I don't think we need 100% unanimity. But I think we should be closer to around 3/4 of the group. And then some other people say, no, I think it's more like 60% or 70%. I go, fine, right? What I wanted to do is have a meaningful discussion about what the decision rule is. So I'm just going to erase these pieces that are the foundation for these other cost functions. But let's try and figure out, so one reason we might care about the decision rule now is because because we can be better off if we have the optimal decision rule. But maybe there's something else. Let's zoom in here and let's say here's an issue, and I'm just going to say that here is A, and maybe here is B. Okay? In other words, here's the cost of voluntary exchange and association, and here is A. What this tells us is this is an issue where we should never use collective action, right? Because everywhere, there is nowhere where this cost function, where the total costs are below A or B. Now this, again, is just a framework for telling stories. I'm putting these in here. Now you could object and you could say, no. A and B are way the heck up here. Fine, right? If A and B were way the heck up there, then we still would have the question of, well, what our optimal decision rule is, but this would not necessarily help us decide whether we should use collective action or not. So this function up here, the purple function, the who I should marry, this would be analytically a good reason why the state should not be involved in deciding who gets to marry each other, right? That's basically what the decision on state-sanctioned marriage is this. It's saying, look, we get to decide whether two men get to marry each other. We get to decide whether a black man and a white woman can marry each other, right? There's still anti-miscegenation laws in some states in the South where it is illegal, right? Or at least historically it was. I'm not sure. I hope most of them have been repealed. I should look into that. But yeah, so I think the first thing this tells us is that there may be some issues. So this starts helping us map this on where G is less than B. But now let's take this pink line. So that's one of the things. So we can now dispense with that because I said we were just going to zoom in where G is less than B and A. And that function, there was nowhere along that function where G was less than B and A. How about here? Well, here it turns out that using collective action is lower cost than B or A, assuming we have a decision rule somewhere in here. If, however, we had a decision rule that was out in here, it turns out that it would be better to use B, definitely. And if we couldn't use B politically, if our decision rule was out somewhere in here, we would want to not use G. We would want to simply use we would simply want to just live with the spillover. By the way, there's no reason why A and B need to be like this. We can flip them. Again, it's just going to lead to a different story. On the other hand, if the only feasible decision rule was somewhere out here, we would want to use B, even though G is less than B and A, given certain decision rules. So it turns out the decision rule itself is essential for whether or not we use B or A. And of course, if our feasible decision rule is only out in this range, if B was not feasible, we would still not want to use G. We would want to just live with the spillover. And you might think that's a little bit silly. But let's take the gay marriage situation again, or state-sanctioned marriage, and let's say we have a cost function like that. Is there a spillover to people getting married? Sure. Some of it's positive, some of it's negative, right? Maybe some people just don't like seeing people of the opposite sex get married. Maybe people they just are very bothered by seeing people of the same sex getting married. There's probably some spillover there. So maybe what we could say is Maybe there's a case where, oh, let's do this. I think this is plausible. If we don't have the optimal decision rule somewhere in here, should we use G? The answer is no. But it turns out that even if we had a decision rule in here, we still wouldn't want to use G, we would want to use B, because voluntary exchange and association is below that. Now, I think that's somewhat plausible, right? If we just all lived with the spillover, I mean, there's a significant positive spillover for most people when somebody else decides to have sex with them. Hopefully it's reciprocal here, in which case I would argue that voluntary exchange and association, which is most of where we live with sex, is lower cost than just living with the spillover. Maybe somebody will show up in my house and want to have sex with me. Maybe they won't, right? Of course, we could force people to have sex with each other using collective action. But again, this would be a case that we can start to tell these stories here. So hopefully that makes some sense as to how we can play with these. Again, I suspect that a lot of the value of this will come into focus when you start telling stories and you start having stories that you want to tell. So I'm going to stop this here and continue on in the next one to talk about what level we should take decisions at, because that turns out to also be a question.